Are we recording? Yeah, yeah. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone of the following information. Propelx is a funding platform, not a broker-dealer. A syndicate, if formed, will be managed by Plank Fund Management Corporation, which is a Nevada-registered venture capital firm. Private investments are highly illiquid and risky and not suitable for all investors. Past performance is not indicative of future results. You should speak with your financial advisor, accountant, and/or attorney when evaluating private offerings. Neither Propelx nor Plank Fund Management nor any of its affiliates makes any recommendations or provides advice about investments. The information you will hear today may make forward-looking statements about investments which have not been reviewed by Propelx or Plank Fund Management. You should not rely on these statements but should carefully evaluate the offering materials in assessing any private investment opportunity. With that, I am delighted to welcome Siddhant, who's been with us before, and I'm really delighted to have you back. So Siddhant is a serial entrepreneur. He's a Harvard graduate, and he's building his next company. His last company was quite a success. You achieved distribution from Siemens and whatnot. I'm sure you'll tell us all about it when you introduce yourself. But please, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself, and then don't get distracted if other people join. Share your screens and go for it. And
All
we
right.
are recording this for folks that are not able to join today. Let's go.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Swati and Hashmida, for putting this together. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen. Yes, we can see.
All right. Let me try to make this full screen. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the kind introduction, Swati. I'll give a little brief about myself and the team before I get into StataDx. So, as background, I'm a serial entrepreneur. This is my second company. My first company was a company called JanaCare, which is currently a point of care company focused on cardiometabolic disease and diabetes. I built a company from ground up to scale to about close to 4.5 million in revenues by 2020, essentially around COVID. At which point the founders exited the company through a secondary buyout. And the company's still going strong, very strong partnerships with many strategics, including Siemens and Roche and AstraZeneca and so on. That point, I transitioned to become essentially an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard, through which I founded Stata, which is my second company, which I'm going to tell you today about. So Stata was formed in 2022, so we are about to hit a 4-year anniversary. The origins of Stata was at the Weiss Institute at Harvard, which is led by Don Inber, who's the scientific founder of the company, and his technology, which was called eRapid at the time. So eRapid was this very novel electrochemical sensing technology that was designed for next generation diagnostic applications. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But essentially, the company spun out of Harvard in 2022. Half the team came from my first company, including Daniel Lukadu, as Chief Scientific Officer and leads our technical program development. Don Inber, who's a scientific founder. And we brought on some investors such as Incept, led by Amar Sani, a very successful medtech entrepreneur himself, and Mass Ventures, which is a deep tech fund focused on innovations out of Massachusetts. So they led our seed round in 2022. We finalized an exclusive worldwide license for the eRapid technology, addressing needs in neurology, cardiology, and renal disease. What we've also done is put together a very strong advisory board comprising of experts in neurology, including folks such as Dr. Dan Daneshwar, who's the head of the brain injury rehab program at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Jens Kuhle out of the University of Basel, is a leading blood biomarker expert, globally renowned and very well published. Julia Cheek was actually a classmate of mine from business school and runs Everly Health. She's an advisor to the company in terms of go-to-market and partnership strategies. Mark Kirtland is our chief business advisor, comes to us from Quanterix, which is actually the market leader in neurology today. It's very relevant to the field, and we'll bring on Mark as a chief business officer later this year as we get closer to commercialization. And finally, we have Tara Butler, who's also an investor through our own fund and individually, but she's a physician herself and used to lead Ascension Ventures in a previous life. So what Stata is doing in a nutshell is really addressing this very old problem in neurology, which is the fact that Biomarkers in neurology are today well characterized and validated, but they tend to be very low in concentration in your bloodstream. And that's because of something called the blood-brain barrier. So anything that emanates from your brain, by the time it goes into your bloodstream through the through the blood-brain barrier, ends up being very low in concentration. So compared to, for example, cardiac markers like cholesterol or more abundant markers like hemoglobin and potassium, these are biomarkers, for example, neurofilament, GFAP, beta 217. These are an order of magnitude lower in concentration. Our chief scientific officer likes to say that measuring these biomarkers is like picking up grains of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So it is certainly something that you cannot do with traditional diagnostic platforms. Platforms that exist today, for example, mass spectrometry, are more advanced platforms like the single molecule analysis systems from Quanterix. They have been very adept at research and discovery. So essentially, in discovering these biomarkers, validating them, doing research studies with them, but not necessarily translating into mainstream clinical diagnostics. And that is a problem, because today the clinical evidence behind some of these markers like neurofilament light, GFAP, beta 217, another one called brain-derived tau, BD tau, across the neurodegenerative spectrum, for example, in multiple sclerosis, in traumatic brain injury, in stroke, in ALS, in Alzheimer's, is fairly well established. Now, there are guidelines now calling out for the use of these biomarkers in both the triage of some of these conditions, but also in active disease monitoring. And that's basically the problem we are trying to solve. The access to these biomarkers in the physician's office, which is oftentimes what's needed. You don't have the time to send it off to a lab and wait 2 weeks to get the results back, because you need to make clinical decisions within a day or within 2 days, and that is simply not possible with the current technology. So what Stata is building is the first point of care finger stick blood testing platform for neurology. We are focused on small set of biomarkers. So I'd like to emphasize that we're not trying to boil the ocean by building 200 tests on a single platform. We are focused on a few biomarkers that have been very well characterized for some of these neurological conditions. For example, MS, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, and stroke. And really building a platform and a play around neurology. Before I go any further, let me play you a video of how this actually works. Because sometimes seeing is believing. So let me play this video, and you will see how the platform works currently, and how and I'll tell you more about how we plan to take it to the market in the coming months. So it's a sample to answer system. So essentially, what you see in the video is a benchtop instrument. Obviously, it looks a little clunkier because it's our current works like prototype. Will look a lot nicer in the next few months. Essentially, you have a finger stick sample that goes into the cartridge that is inserted into the instrument. About 40 microliters of input sample, which is essentially obtainable by a finger stick and can be done in a clinic by a nurse, or even at home eventually by the patient themselves. And within 25 minutes today, you get your answer. In this case, we get a result for neurofilament, which is, in my case, it was normal, so my brain's not on fire, basically. But essentially, neurofilament means can apply to a slew of different neurological conditions, starting from MS to ALS, Alzheimer's, TBI, and so on and so forth. Before I get into the market strategy and so the progress we've made towards advancing this technology, let me give you a little bit more about the core technology that's driving all this, right? So as I mentioned to you before, Stata was formed out of this core technology called eRapid. And eRapid was originally developed to address needs in biochemical sensing, where sensitivity and low blood volumes were important. And that's very true in neurology today. In traditional electrochemical sensors, for example, a product called the Abbott iStat, which is probably used in every hospital in the world today, there's a phenomenon called biofouling. What happens is that when you apply blood or plasma or any kind of complex fluid on a sensor, it tends to foul the surface. In simple words, what it does is your blood contains, it's like a minestrone soup. You've got all kinds of proteins in it. You're trying to pick one out of many. And oftentimes you have what's called a non-specific binding event. So in addition to picking up the molecule that you're trying to pick up with an immunoassay, you end up with a lot of noise, which is these non-specific binding events. And because of that, your noise floor goes up. So when you try to amplify that signal, you don't amplify the signal alone, you amplify the noise. So what you get is garbage, right? So that's what happens in a traditional sensor. What we do with our technology built on the core platform that was built at Harvard is basically inject this anti-fouling layer that is novel, that allows us to conduct through it, but at the same time, it repels all these non-specific binding events through which we can essentially maintain, quote unquote, a signal to noise. And in the second step, which is the second piece of the IP and the second family of patents that we have filed and have been granted, we amplify that signal. When you amplify that signal, because the noise floor is low, we can actually detect biomarkers with a fairly high degree of granularity that you otherwise would not. The other advantage of our platform with the signal generation is that the mechanism by which it's done, it also allows us to multiplex. So in order to, for us to measure more than one, it's fairly easy without doing very complex sort of microfluidics. And I can get into more details in the Q&A about how that specifically works.
Yeah.
So as a competitive benchmark, we essentially would be the first sort of highly sensitive point of care platform that will hit the market. Today, Abbott iSight is probably the closest that comes to being a platform that has a brain biomarker on it. There's a biomarker for TBI that Abbott offers today, but is only in plasma. It's got some own challenge. It's got its own challenges with respect to getting to market. All the others are essentially lab systems. They're not really something that you can deploy in a clinic and be operated by a nurse or a layperson. The first molecule or the first biomarker we're going after is something called neurofilament light. So neurofilament is essentially a structural protein. Think of it as, the troponin I. It's basically an inflammatory marker of the brain. Every time you've got damage you've got neuronal damage, this biomarker is released first into the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, and then into peripheral blood, so essentially your blood or plasma. It is a very sensitive marker. So anytime there's brain damage, neurofilament will spike. It is not very specific, which is actually an advantage because it allows us to be used across the spectrum of neurodegenerative conditions. Its primary application today is in MS. It's the first disease area where it's been validated and now has made it into guidelines for monitoring patients with MS. Second, in traumatic brain injury, to determine what's called return to play. So you have a concussion, you need to know when you're okay to go back into normal action. That's a very important clinical question to answer. Neurofilament will allow you to do that. And finally, as a response biomarker, a lot of clinical trials, for example, in ALS, are today using neurofilament as a surrogate endpoint to basically measure therapeutic response. And one of many drugs have now been approved by the FDA on the basis of neurofilament alone. There's a drug called tofersen that was the first one, and now there's many others that are following that. So in essence, it has become the marquee marker in neurology, and it's now backed by two things: clinical guidelines. So it's not like me telling physician, hey, use neurofilament in your clinical practice. It's in the guidelines, and this is an important piece of what we are doing. We're trying to measure a biomarker that's already gained what's called clinical consensus. So there is no ambiguity around what the cutoff should be, how it should be used in clinical practice, and so on and so forth. The second important development is that late in 2024, CPT codes for some of these neurological biomarkers were established. Nationwide rates are still undergoing the process of getting done, but the median MAC rates, which is the Medicare administrative rates, across the country are about $130 for these tests, which is actually fairly good. If you compare it to cardiology or infectious disease, it's an order of magnitude higher. I mean, there you're looking at $20 or $30, maybe $10 per test. Here you're looking at $130. And one of the reasons for that is that, what you're essentially doing is reducing the number of MRI scans. So you're pegging it to something that is thousands of dollars. So, people are happy to pay less money for getting the same kind of clinical outcomes. Let me spend a minute or two explaining the first application, which is MS with neurofilament. Essentially, with with MS, what often happens is that you've got sorry, I'm getting too many calls. What often happens in MS is that you go through this sort of sinusoid of relapses and remissions. And it's very hard to monitor that unless you do an MRI scan today. And these are not your regular MRI scan. These are contrast MRI scans, which are very invasive and something you cannot do every few weeks. What neurofilament has shown is that it is a surrogate for these scans in a way, in the sense that whenever there is a scar formation that's happening in your MRI scan, neurofilament will start rising. So it's actually very good in terms of knowing what your disease activity is, and doing longitudinal measurements of neurofilament in the clinic or even at home over time can enable a physician to understand whether the disease activity is going north or south, and if the therapy that the patient is on is actually working or not. And one advantage that MS has, which is very unique to it compared to all other neurodegenerative conditions, is that there are about 25 different therapies available, compared to something like Alzheimer's, with only 1 or 2 therapies that are actually useful and actually work. So because there are more therapies available, it is actually imperative for physicians to figure out which therapy is actually working. So in essence, who are the responders, who are the non-responders, and based on that, up-titrate therapy or change therapies and so on. It's called step-up therapy, and if you look at insurance policies, they actually talk about the use of lower efficacy therapies first, which have fewer side effects, and eventually escalating up the ladder to more higher efficacy therapies, which also are more expensive. So they can range from $10,000 per patient per year to $100,000 per patient per year. So you got to be very precise in your diagnostic to know whether it makes sense for you to escalate the therapy or switch therapies altogether. That's where neurofilament plays a big role. And this algorithm that I presented here, where based on whether it's low, intermediate, or high, you can make decisions on more monitoring or therapeutic changes already in the guidelines. So that's the advantage of having this biomarker on our platform, is ready to go the moment we get a clearance with the FDA. In terms of the market size, we're looking at approximately 1.7 or $1.8 billion between the clinical care markets and the research use only markets. I'll spend a second describing what REO, or research use only, means. Essentially means the use of these tests in clinical trials or clinical research. That by itself is a fairly significant market. In fact, almost 100% of neurology blood biomarkers are in REO today, simply because there's been very few FDA approvals, and most people use it either as a lab developed test or in clinical research. Now what's going on is that because the CPT code's in place, there is this push towards getting these products through the IVD process of the FDA and getting approved. And that's where we are today. In terms of the go-to-market, the initial beachhead for us would be the MS specialist. It's actually a good thing for us, for a small company, to have a very concentrated market base. We're looking at about 200 centers in the US and about 200 more in Europe. These are the early adopters. And they're the ones who do a lot of clinical trials. So when we go into the market first as a research use only product, we would actually go after some of these sites, because the PIs there are the ones who are actually doing most of the studies. Eventually, we expand the market from that to neurologists, then to primary care physicians, urgent care, and so on. So you expand the market through the provider base as you go along, as you sort of mature into the market over time. In terms of unit economics, fairly good margins. Average selling price of about $190 to $100. Our cost of goods at medium scale is about $14. We're talking about 10,000 tests, per year and so on. So it's fairly reasonable for us to hit these unit economics. If you look at the contribution margin per test, it could be anywhere from $80 to $90 per test, which is very good for a diagnostic product, because that's your consumable. That's 80% of your revenues outside of the devices. In terms of clinical performance and what we have done so far to validate whether the test actually works or not, we have worked very closely with the University of Basel to establish analytical performance metrics, so we can measure from 2 pgml all the way to 200 pgml, and that's important because you need to be able to measure all the way down to the limits of detection where the thresholds or the cutoffs are, and we do that today. Precision studies are ongoing. We expect to get to about 10% or thereabouts at both high and low levels, which is important for a diagnostic. What we've recently done is also benchmarked our performance with clinical samples. So this study was done late last year with clinical samples, in collaboration with the University of Basel. We demonstrated a method comparison which was comparable to the others in the space. If you look at Siemens Alamar Protein Simple, which is Biotechne, we get fairly similar correlation with clinical samples as they did. These are separate studies, but gives you a flavor of how the platform is performing, not just in spike plasma or synthetic samples, but in actual clinical samples. So this is an important data point, which leads us to sort of our next milestone, which is essentially building up towards our FDA launch and also our research use only clearance. We've recently formed a partnership with a major pharmaceutical company. It'll be public in a week or so. Company in Switzerland, so you can probably guess who it is. They'll be funding us non-dilutively to accelerate our path towards FDA by doing these de-risking studies with the Swiss MS cohort, which is essentially 8 sites across Switzerland, which is basically the largest MS cohort in the world. And this also unlocks a research use only opportunity for us, because these 8 sites are also going to be customers for us when we go commercial next year. But also addresses key questions that the FDA asked us, including establishing cutoffs and sort of study duration that we'll have to do for the pivotal studies that are coming up next year. So in anticipation of what's to come, what we're doing now is raising our Series A1. So essentially, this is aimed to get us to 2 key milestones. One is to complete the product, get it to a point where we can launch it in the research use only market, by the end of the year, and also be able to gather the requisite clinical data in collaboration with our partners in Switzerland and our pharma partner to be able to then initiate FDA studies in the first half of next year. We are also very closely working, as I said, with the pharmaceutical company that I haven't mentioned, but they're sponsoring us. They're most likely to also sponsor FDA studies, and therefore we have constricted the raise to about 2 million right now, because we anticipate the funds for the FDA to come through a strategic partner, which could very well be then when we publish our data in Q3 of this year. Currently, the pre-money for this round is 13.8 million. We've got close to 1.6 committed right now. The first closing is in February. The second closing is on March 31st, basically end of Q1. We are offering 25% warrant coverage for investors who would like to close by then as an incentive. So far, the company has raised about 4.5 million. Our lead investors are Incept and Mass Ventures, and we got new investors coming in, including a strategic investment by Drummond, which is a manufacturer, and that's going to be collaborating with us on our cartridge manufacturing going forward. Finally, I know we are getting close to the half hour. I wanted to sort of emphasize where the company is with respect to our strategic partnerships. As I mentioned, we've got a big pharmaceutical partner that we are working with. In addition to that, we have existing relationships with many of these strategics, including Roche, Siemens, Revvity, Quanterix, and Fujirebio Bio. Some of them supply us antibodies, but all of them are looking for basically the next generation near patient or point of care platform, either to address their needs in neurology or to address the needs in all these markets where a more sensitive point of care platform is needed. So these are all potential strategic anchors for Stata going forward, which is what we're gearing the company towards, so that we can essentially get a strategic anchor that helps us through the FDA, but also works with us closely to expand our indications from MS into Alzheimer's and stroke and TBI and so on in the future. So in summary, Stata is a point-of-care diagnostic company focused on neurology, spun off from the Wyss Institute at Harvard. We have now de-risked our platform with our first application called neurofilament light, which is a key biomarker for neurodegenerative conditions. Primary indications are in multiple sclerosis. We have ongoing studies sponsored by a major pharmaceutical company, leading us towards readiness for FDA clearance next year. And we're raising a Series A1 now to fund the next stage to basically finish the product, get it ready for the REO, research use only market, and get started with the FDA studies by the first half of next year. So let me end here, and I'm happy to do a Q&A after this.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions, Siddhant and Ziad. If you have additional questions, please add them in. You can say it loud or you can put it in the chat and whatnot. All right, Siddhant, let's just get started. So, you show on this slide alone, label expansion and to TBI and ALS. I mean, that was my main question, is that you're going after multiple sclerosis right now. What is the
Yep.
timeline to which, for example, you could get to Parkinson's or stroke? Is the number one question. And currently, so if are you only going to be measuring NFL, or are you also going to be measuring other things? Um, so that's another question. So that's really about, let's answer those, then we'll go forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually skipped this slide in terms of go-to-market in our pipeline, but I'm glad you brought up that question. So the short answer is we're doing neurofilament for multiple sclerosis as a first indication, because that's the most mature, and the FDA has been very keen in terms of getting that across as an IVD. But the label expansion into TBI and ALS will be fairly straightforward. Like typically what you do is you get your first indication through, and then you do your second and the third indication. They take, obviously you do some bridging studies, but they're fairly easier once you get your first indication through. So that's what we have planned, right? So, we plan on getting our MS indication. Well, we'll submit for the MS indication sometime, let's say late next year. The studies start in the first half. It takes 6 to 9 months to complete the studies, wrap them up, and package it together and submit to the FDA. As soon as we do that, we'll embark on the next set of studies that we intend to do for TBI. And TBI is probably, concussion is probably the most mature. It's the second most mature indication for NFL. As far as other biomarkers are concerned, so pTau217, which is a key biomarker for Alzheimer's, and it's been in the news quite a bit, is the second biomarker that we have preliminary data for. And I didn't show it in this presentation just to be, for the purpose of being brief. But basically, we have very promising data for pTau217. We plan on restarting that work essentially towards the end of this year, because essentially our asset development team is working on basically completing the NFL test this year. As soon as that finishes, we'll pick up the piece and pick up the pieces and start working on pTau217 next, and then followed by GFAP. These other markers, keep in mind, the amount of time it took us to develop NFL is not going to be the amount of time it will take us to develop pTau217 and GFAP, because the platform's already built. Now it's really a question of just changing the antibodies and re-optimizing the asset for the next biomarker and so on. So yeah, the short answer is we'll do NFL, expand the indications, in parallel we'll do pTau217. And a lot of this is actually one of the reasons why we are working with pharma, because a lot of it is driven by how the therapeutic market looks like. Yeah. MS has a very mature therapeutic market, which is why we pursued it. And there's backing now, like there's a big pharma, the market leader is backing us now. With pTau217, which is for Alzheimer's, there's a lot of interest. However, as you know, the Alzheimer's therapeutic market hasn't really panned out the way one thought it would. So it will probably take another 1 or 2 years for these drugs to be successful. Once that happens, then there'll be a lot of impetus towards getting this into the market. And that's what we are trying to work with. And obviously, as a small company, you can't do 10 things, right? You've got to pick your battles, and that's what we've done with NFL.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, the reason I'm asking this question, we'd worked with another company called Amprion, and they do, they take a spinal tap, and I don't see Parkinson's mentioned here, but that is a definitive or indication of Parkinson's, and they can do that again, similar to this, which is very small concentrations and way ahead of time. So another question I had was, now at what point do people start testing for Alzheimer's? Because what we're discovering now is that, all of what is called the plaque, or how medical professionals call it that, I think, all of these start forming way ahead of the symptoms actually appearing. And so for that reason, it becomes almost, just like we do our blood tests every year, it becomes almost mandatory after, let's say, you're hitting 40 to be testing for neurodegenerative diseases. So my
Yeah.
question for you is, how do you see that impacting this? Are you going to be doing Parkinson's? Why are you developing it as a home kind of thing? Because nobody's going, it's not like diabetes where you want to test it on a daily basis. So that's a separate question, but
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a great question. So I would say that we are not necessarily looking at the home for all applications, but I'll be very clear that we are not trying to be a first diagnostic for any of these conditions, right? I mean, for a complete diagnosis, you will still end up doing an MRI scan, whether it's an MS
Yes,
or TBI or Alzheimer's and so on. So we're not going after the one test you need to do, because if you need to do a test one time, you don't need a point of care device. You can just send a
exactly.
sample to a lab and you get your
Yes.
diagnosis. What we're trying to do is where
We lost you, or is it me? All right. Um, okay, we lost Siddhant. I hope he comes back. Is it me? Hmm, let me just message him. Well, yeah, it's just you and I. But let me just message him. Okay, he's joining in 2 minutes, or well, I hope sooner than that. Internet issue for him. Sorry about that. All right.
Hey, sorry guys.
Hello.
Hi, sorry, I don't know what happened to my Wi-Fi. It's just inactive. I just restart that.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
So
Yes.
I don't know where you guys lost me, but I guess you were talking about diagnosis and monitoring
You
at
were
home.
saying that you don't mean this to be the only diagnostic for stuff and for all diseases, and you would still have to do the MRI. You don't have, if in fact it was the only, if it was a one-time diagnostic, then you could just take a blood test at the lab.
exactly, exactly. So that's one thing that I would like to mention here, right? Like basically, what we are going after is, if you look at all the applications we are pursuing, we're going after applications where there's a need to monitor or there's a need to get your result right away, right? So for example, in MS, there's a need to monitor the patient frequently. So it could be 6 times a year, it could be 8 times a year, because you go through these relapses where oftentimes you don't know whether it's a real relapse or something else is going on, right? So kind of like a longitudinal monitoring thing that can happen in the clinic or even at home, right? So a lot of patients, physicians would have told us that, they would give it to them when they switch them on a new therapy. They would just give them this device for home use eventually, so they could monitor themselves and see if they're getting better or worse. And you could monitor once every month or something to that effect, right? So there's that one need. Or when you have symptoms, which often is what happens. One of the challenges in neurology, Swati, is that, one of our neurologists who's actually an MS patient herself, she actually described it to me. Like, when you go to a doctor and you say, I have fatigue, a physician or a patient cannot measure fatigue. A biomarker can, right? And that's where this becomes very useful. Like at the point of care, when you're doing your clinical assessment of the patient, when the patients come back for a follow-up and you have like tingling or fatigue and other things, that's when a neurofilament measure can be very useful, because it objectively tells you whether you're doing better or worse. So that's number one, where you have disease monitoring done longitudinally. And that is true for MS and also for ALS. The other applications are when there's a time criticality to the measure. Like, for example, in concussion, you need to know whether, in a time-bound fashion, whether a concussion is happening or not. If so, how's the patient recovering over time, right? So you need to know. You can't wait 2 weeks to get your results, because you don't know what to do with the patient until you get your results back. So there is a time criticality to that, and that's also true for something like stroke, right? In Alzheimer's, what we are seeing now, the need for screening is certainly there, like in primary care and so on. But the bigger challenge now with Alzheimer's is not just the fact that you need to get these patients on drugs and identify them early and so on. Once these patients get on drugs, so imagine like 3 years from now, 4 years from now, there'll be millions of patients on various kinds of amyloid-lowering therapies. They will have to be monitored for safety. A lot of them have, other issues, something called ARIA, which is very well documented now, where you have to get an MRI done every few weeks. It's logistically impossible for you to do an MRI every few weeks, right? You just can't, because wait times for MRIs are like 3 months, 4 months. So that's where a biomarker and doing monitoring at home or in the clinic becomes very useful. So long story short, what we're going after is not the diagnosis of neurodegenerative conditions, the monitoring or triage of acute, phases in neurodegenerative conditions.
Understood.
So that's one. And then you asked about Parkinson's. So certainly we've got interest in Parkinson's. For example, there's a biomarker called alpha-synuclein, which
Yes, that's the one.
that's the one that has come out, right? So there's data in blood for it as well. I think it's really a question of timing the market, because once the point of a diagnostic becomes very critical once you have a therapy backing it. So we haven't reached that in Parkinson's yet. That probably will happen, the next few years, hopefully sooner. And that's really the conundrum. Like, you've got the biomarkers in place, but the therapies have to come into the market for the biomarkers to actually be useful.
But Alzheimer's, we do have therapies.
There are therapies. There's 2 or 3, but they, as you know, the data is sketchy at best, right? I mean, to be honest, like you ask any clinicians, in the absence of nothing, getting like a small incremental value is something. But at the same time, payers are very loath to pay like $25,000, $30,000 a year for a very small incremental clinical benefit, right? That's the issue with Alzheimer's. That is not true, for example, in MS or even in ALS, where the therapies have actually evolved quite a bit.
Okay, understood. So tell me, for NFL, does the quantity determine the intensity of the disease, and is it a biomarker for multiple? You said it's a biomarker for multiple diseases. So how do you know which is happening?
Yeah. So see, it's once you know the disease, so NFL would be used in this case, for example, on patients who we already know have MS, right? So you already know the diagnostic is MS. So you are monitoring them longitudinally. Same with TBI, same with ALS. So it's not like there's a question mark on what condition the patient has. It could very well happen they could have multiple of these conditions. NFL is really a measure of inflammation in your brain, right? So it's really measuring inflammation in your brain. A lot of these therapies that are coming are actually trying to address that inflammation. So lowering NFL, it's like lowering cholesterol in your heart. The same thing, right? So it's the same sort of kind of an analogy. So lowering NFL is generally good for you. Higher NFL is generally bad for you.
Okay. Another question. So just wanted to follow up on the diseases question that we discussed just before this. How early can we? So we're really talking about monitoring. So it doesn't. I mean, since this is not the diagnostic, early or late is not a question which is relevant here, is it? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly use NFL. So, for example, it can also be used as a general brain health marker, right? Like the pharma company we're working with, they want to use it as a general purpose brain health marker, because today there is none, right? Like if you look at cardiology, you do a lipid profile on yourself, and you know your general sort of cardiac health, or if you do a hemoglobin A1C, you know your general metabolic health. There is no such thing in brain health today. NFL is being touted as being one of them, including also p-tau217, which is more specific to cognition, like Alzheimer's. So there is interest there, but I would still say we're scratching the surface, right? The true value of this right now, and I'm talking about the immediate next 2 years, is in therapeutic decision making. Physician needs to know, is the patient doing better or worse with the drug? And that's where this comes in. This is a very blunt tool to say yes or no, and then the physician can decide what to do after that.
Actually, we have an introduction for you to one of our other startups. It's called Neurology.
Okay.
And they are doing brain health based on 3 different things. They actually ask patients to do an MRI, and then a blood test, and then some games that you play online. Based on that, they come up with a comprehensive brain age score, right? They could, instead of having an MRI, potentially they could use your test, which is easier to do and cheaper.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we could see. Anyway, separate from that, okay. So reimbursement, I had a question reimbursement, but I think you already explained that there are codes for it already, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so so once this gets approved, which hopefully will be towards the end of next year, it can go into hospitals like right away. There is not a wait time.
Yeah, and the other thing that I forgot to mention clearly is that there is the big research use only market. So it's not like we have to wait till FDA to happen for us to go to market. Today, the neurology market is almost 90% research use only. For example, Quanterix, which is the market leader today in NFL, they do about 130 or 140 million in revenues. 80% of that is from NFL alone. 100% of it is from research use only, right? So,
oh my God.
So that gives you, yeah.
So when are you ready for research use only? When do you start getting revenue?
So we start getting revenues in the first half of 2027, right? So that's what the use of funds is, right? One is to get us ready for the research use only launch, and the second is to also initiate, be in a position to initiate FDA studies next year. So 2 things happen this year: complete the product, get it ready for research use only. So we'll make, for example, our first, 25 to 30 units. Few thousand tests, and basically be in a position to start billing customers, right? I mean, I'm not talking about massive revenues, but at least, we get our foot in the door. And then, obviously, as we, by the time we get FDA clearance, that commercial hockey stick will happen. But, we're not entirely independent. That's one thing that is important about this market to emphasize, that, oftentimes what happens is it's a binary outcome, right? Like if you don't get FDA, you don't go into the market. Here, you don't have that issue because you have a research market, which is very well established, because every pharma company today is using NFL or p-tau217 in their clinical trials. They all want to do monitoring at home. They all want to monitor more frequently. Because you can imagine, right? For pharma, monitoring more frequently means shorter trials and fewer patients. So for them, it's a lot of money if you can monitor these patients more frequently and get more dense data. So that'll be a key strategy for us in the research market.
Which brings me to the question. You had a slide 17 where you showed all these Quanterix and the other guys. I wanted to understand, there we go. I wanted to understand what is your advantage? I mean, these guys are already monitoring NFL and somewhat better than you are. So how are you different and what is your advantage?
I mean, these are all lab-based systems. You have to ship the sample off, wait 2 weeks. That's a challenge. Like, it's a logistical nightmare. We can do it on the spot in the clinic, and that's a huge advantage. The other thing that people have tried is, spotting what are called dried blood spots or dried plasma cards, where you spot it on a piece of paper, ship it off to a lab. Guess what? It doesn't work in neurology because the samples are, the concentrations are so low that you cannot recover enough analyte to actually be able to measure them. So the advantage for us is that we can do it on the spot. You can have a distributed sort of testing model versus having to wait 2-3 weeks to get your results and so on.
But the reimbursement for them is the same, $130 per, roughly.
$130, and that's another sort of advantage for us. So what happens in a diagnostic is that when a lab runs the test, they get to bill for the test, right? So they make the money. When I place my device in a physician office, the physician office bills for the test. So they actually, make them. So there's a difference because you actually, in a way, the physicians have more than one incentive to be using obviously as long as the test is up to par and works well, compared to the gold standard, then that'd be an advantage because they can bill for these codes very easily.
Right. Okay. So just to summarize, we have a large market. We've already looked at the competition. Is anyone else doing these kind of at point of care devices? There's so much going on in healthcare that.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to keep track of everyone, especially startups, because you don't know how much is real, how much is not, especially in diagnostics. Because I built my first company during the dawn of Theranos and the dusk.
Yes.
And I know sort of those questions would always come.
Yes.
So the short answer is that if you look at the strategics, strategics would prefer to buy versus build, right? I mean, it's a very standard thing for them. They're looking at this from an acquisition perspective rather than building it internally, and that's what they've done. That's what they'll end up doing. The other companies, for example, there's a company called SpinChip. This was actually bought a year ago by bioMérieux, which is a family-owned diagnostic company in Europe, a multi-billion-dollar company. For about $160 million pre-revenue, pre-FDA, based on publication. They were pursuing a different market. They're pursuing high sensitivity troponin I, which is a cardiac marker. Again, high sensitivity. So that's one sort of data point I have where, there's another player, of course, pursuing a different application. So we don't know how well the platform will do for neurological biomarkers. So that's one data point. There's a few others, but the traditional strategy that people have taken, Swati, is to go after established menus, right? By that I mean, complete blood count, cholesterol, thyroid profiles, and so on with point of care, which or infectious disease, right? Like that's been sort of the flavor of the season since COVID. We chose a different strategy, right? From an application perspective. That said, again, who knows what's being built in some garage somewhere? There's obviously players. It's obviously a tough problem, right? Like the technical issue with biofouling is not easy because I've built a company before. Getting sensitivity with low blood volume, you've got two constraints. You got to take very little blood and try to measure more from it than you would with traditional platforms. Not easy, right? So it requires not just to be able to get the science right, but also manufacturing, repeatability, reproducibility, and these are things that we have demonstrated already in our data that I showed you. That we are getting there, and that's where I think we'll have an advantage as we get deeper into sort of manufacturing transfer and so on.
Right. So just reiterating that in terms of the market, there's the research use only and post FDA approval. Post FDA approval, we already have CPT codes. Excellent if we are able to get through that. But even if not, then we have research. The others just left, but we should anyways wrap this up because it's interesting. So we do have the research use only market. We have the competition, which is kind of not, we don't know so much. There's lots going on there.
Yeah.
Thankfully, you don't necessarily have a regulatory hurdle because you may choose to do research use only. And obviously you're working on this technology alongside Novartis or Roche, I guess, one of the two.
Yeah, one of them. You'll know in a week.
Yeah, okay. All right, very good. Well, this is exciting, and these are the potential comps.
Yeah, these are the comps. There's the spin chip that I mentioned, the Cerebell, which actually went public. It's an point of care EEG, right, for seizures and so on. But that's another example of something in neurology point of care that has done well. I mean, they're doing decent revenues now. There's another company called Octave, which is actually focused on MS, different approach to it, but they're very well funded, and they've also been at it for a while. So there are comps in the space, and what I'm seeing now is that there's been a change in sort of the market dynamics for diagnostics, right? If you look at what has happened in the last few months, and I think I've shared these slides, but if not, I'll share them again. Basically, what you're seeing is diagnostics geared towards precision medicine, right? So a lot of this happens in oncology, but if you think about what we're doing with neurology and MS, it actually is precision medicine. It's enabling the choice of therapy that the patient gets on. Not necessarily selecting the therapy, but at least ruling out what therapies don't work, right? So that's where we think diagnostics are headed, and a lot of strategics are now looking at precision medicine beyond oncology, whether in neurology or cardiology. And I think that's where the play is, right? If you look at all of them, every single one of them, barring one or two, are all focused on enabling precision medicine as a category.
Yeah. And I think the key is, see, when you showed the competition or the exit comps, those are single disease for the most part, right? If you just go to that
They are.
right?
They are, yeah.
And if you could build this as a platform for multiple, which is the first question I asked, that would be really great. Right?
You could, but you got to get your first application right, Swati. I think that's one thing that I've realized, that a lot of times people end up building a platform and they're like, we're everything to everything, to everyone. And that becomes a problem because you don't have, the challenges. For example, you look at a lot of companies, they're building like panels with like 20 tests. The reimbursement per test is like $5. So you do 30 tests and you get like $30 out of it, right? It's the same amount of money, time, and effort to ship 1 million of anything. You might as well ship something that gets you premium reimbursement. So one of the things that we have done conscientiously with Stata is to pick areas where the reimbursement is at a premium, because $130 test means that I can bill an average selling price. My average selling price can be $100, right? I can make up to $80 per test, even if my cost of goods were 20. Changes a lot of things. I have to ship 10,000 of these to get to a certain, to get to 10 million in revenues, right? Very different from if my reimbursement was $10. So I think that's an important thing to mention here. And this is not like pie in the sky, right? Like the codes are in place. It's not something that we propose we will bill for. I mean, this is already being reimbursed today at that rate.
All right, so then let's wrap this up now. And I thank you for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you for listening. All right, sounds good.